All right, so a lot of people have been asking for something like this, and I'm basically going to be doing a PvE tier list for classes in The Elder Scrolls Online. Oftentimes, PvPers like to do this for classes in PvP, and of course, it's categorized according to things like 1vxing, things like group play, just things like solo play and stuff like that. I'll go over basically every category there is for PvE, and we'll play around with this. It's going to be kind of fun, and don't be offended if I guess, talk trash on your class at times. All right, so we now have a total of 7 classes for the Elder Scrolls Online as of update 38. And a lot of the things I'll be saying, at least for the endgame part, or endgame category for these classes, is going to be based on my recent video, Optimizing and Organizing Your Trials group for update 38. And you can go watch that to see what's the logical process behind why groups are doing certain classes for certain rules. First, to start off, we'll go with, I guess, for a lot of new players who are probably watching this video to figure out which class they want to play. We get this question a lot in the ESU Discord server. What class should I play? I don't know what class to play. Which is the best class? And I'm going to be straight up with you. As a new player, it genuinely does not matter. Even if you're looking at mid-game or even a lot of end-game, it genuinely doesn't matter which class you pick. So basically, simply put, every class is essentially S tier for any new player. There will be some class mechanics, such as with Necromancer's Blast Bones, that might make some of your combat feel clunky, maybe. Or there will be some playstyles with, for example, Sorcerer Pets over here. You might not like it. So it's kind of up to you to try out the different classes at the start and see what you like and what you want to settle on in terms of not just the combat, but also the aesthetics. So a lot of people are into Templar because it looks cool. A lot of people like the mobility and the healing capabilities of the Nightblade over here because it's easier on them as a newer player. But you genuinely just can't go wrong with any class as a new player. So that's the first category. The second category is when you're talking about 4-man dungeon stuff. Again, you really can't go wrong here. Every class has their own access to utilities, their own self-healing capabilities to help you survive. I would say perhaps when you are wanting to pay more attention to mechanics and also not suffer too much DPS loss, classes like Nightblade and maybe in certain cases Necromancer might not be as friendly. So in terms of friendliness for people trying to get into dungeon content, veteran dungeon and veteran dungeon hard mode content, this will be the tier list I give in terms of comfort. So we have Arcanist, Warden, Dragon Knight, Templar, Sorcerer at S tier, and we have Nightblade and Necromancer at A tier in terms of comfort. Okay, so that's the second category. The third category is when we talk about roles. So this is going to be interesting because now we have to talk about subcategories for roles. So we're talking about tanking, okay, for dungeons now. We'll start with dungeons. For tanking, you can't really go wrong with DK. So for now, let me just take all these out so you can see which one's DK, which one's not. So this is Dragon Knight. Dragon Knight for early game, mid game, end game, dungeons, raids, whatever, will always be S tier as a tank. The Arcanist, the newest class, is pretty solid too. It has a lot of sustain. It's very tanky. You can't really go wrong with it in terms of tanking the 4-man content. For other things like the Necromancer, it can be up there, S tier, although I would say it's not as good as DK or Arcanist right now. Warden is also up there. It's somewhere between S and A, so I'm going to give it an A for tanking, for 4-man content. Templar is garbage, unfortunately. Sorc is kind of copium. You can make it work. You can make Templar work too, but it's just not as good or anywhere near as comfortable as a DK or even a Necro. So yeah, it's just unfortunate. For Nightblade, it's kind of in the same realm as Sorc. You can make it work. then it's great if you can make it work. But in terms of like efficiency and ease, this is what the tier list will look like for 4-man content for tanking. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about tanking trials. And when I say 4-man content, I mean arenas as well. I'm going to talk about trials. So trials, it's basically going to look like this. Yeah, I mean, it's basically this. So for trial tanking, you have DK at the top. You have necro tanking at the top as well. There's a lot of areas in specific content like Dreadsail Reef where necro off tanking is really nice. Necro main tanking Teleria is really nice because of dot mitigation from the Necromancer, and of course it's Wraith. We also do have Arcanist tanking. It's kind of there right now. It's still a new class. People are still trying to figure it out. But as a tank, again, it kind of translates 4-man to 12-man quite nicely in terms of sustain and mitigation. Warden tanking can be good. I am actually going to probably move this down a little bit because usually the Warden is the healer. So you could make Warden tanking fine. It's probably somewhere between B and Copium. Sork tanking is very, very niche. If it weren't for the fact that it is sometimes used for specific things in in-game content, I would probably put at Copium or garbage as well. But for now, it's at B. Nightblade tanking, again, it can work, but why play that over DK tanking? It's probably no reason, really. Okay, so we've talked about tanking for 4-man content and trials. Now we're going to move on to healers. Let's talk about healers for 4-man content. So again, you really just can't go wrong healing 4-man content with any of these classes. But in terms of efficiency and comfort, I would definitely say DK is kind of coping here. Sork is somewhere between B and Copium. I don't exactly know where to put Sork here because it can work very well. It just takes maybe a bit more experience to pull off, especially if you're trying to get into it as a newer player. For DK healing works phenomenally well in both 4-man content and 12-man content. However, it requires a lot of things, not a lot of things, a couple prerequisites for it to work. It has immense, massive AoE healing, but in 4-man content, you're going to see your groups move around a lot due to mechanics or just the nature of the fight or perhaps your strategy. So DK healing kind of gets a little dampened by the fact that the members of the group may have to move around a bit. So your main source of healing comes from Cinder Storm, which is a stationary ground-based AoE. And while you can equip things like Combat Prayer and stuff like that to hit the people who are moving, it just kind of takes away from the purpose of, well, they're not standing in my AoE, and I have to recast it quite often compared to a larger AoE like the Templars have with their ritual, and it's just easier on the Templar compared to DK healer. Arcanist, it's kind of like, so Arcanist, a lot of people I think are mistaken with the Arcanist in terms of its healing capabilities. It has decent healing capabilities. It just will never really heal or out-heal things like Warden or Templar on the number scale. It's more, I feel like, for shielding. So it's somewhere between S and A, I would say. So it has really good toolkit for 4-man healing. Necromancer healing can work. It does have some issues, though, just kind of like the DK. I would say just because of the result and a couple other skills that can be provided for the group, I would put it at probably A or somewhere around B. Somewhere around there. Unfortunately, there's no sub tier. Nightblade healing, of course, can work. It actually is a lot of burst heal. It does provide a good amount of healing. Although in ESO, it's not an issue of healing strictly. It's because you will easily overheal with any of these classes. It's just a matter of what can it offer to the group besides healing. So I probably would put this again at B. Wardens are S tier for healing in 4-man and 12-man content. Templars, really great too. And that's really it for 4-man content. This is what I would say is kind of like the 4-man tier list for healing. Now, when we're talking about raids or trials, 12-man content for healing, it's going to look slightly different here. So for the most part, the healer will never, right now anyway, be Necromancer, because you usually have Necromancer tank or DPS to provide Colossus and the buffs that, or debuffs that the Necromancer class can give. Dragon Knight healing is really, 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 really rare in trials or endgame content. It can work. Typically, though, I would advise you get experience on the other classes before you hop on the DK. And I would say it's fairly strong depending on the fights, because a lot of trial fights can be stationary. However, most groups will probably tell you to bring something else for the group raid composition. S tier is definitely going to be Warden, Templar, and Arcanist. I would even say Nightblade, because again, it kind of depends on your composition at that point. So Nightblade would somewhere right now be sitting around S or A. Sorc is right now also garbage. I mean, again, garbage and copium are kind of the same tier here, but you just would not really see these three classes ever brought in as a healer at the moment for 12-man content. Okay, now that we've covered the tank, healer for 4-man and 12-man content, let's talk about DPS. This is probably what most of you will be playing. I'm not putting these in garbage right now. I'm just kind of reorganizing it. Okay, so DPS for 4-man content. Again, you really just can't go wrong here. Templar does have a sustain issue, so I would probably put that at A. Nightblade can be really good for again, self-survival capabilities, self-healing capabilities while doing damage. And it's a very fun rotation. Arcanist, I feel like, would somewhere be around probably an A or B. I feel like, ironically, even though it is a low APM playstyle, you need to kind of be very intimately acquainted with what mechanics happen for you to fully take advantage of a beam Arcanist build, because a lot of mechanics and attacks in 4-man content do stagger and interrupt channeling. So I'll probably put it around A or B. If in the hands of an experienced player, I can easily see it being somewhere around the S and A. Necromancer, again, I would probably put this one at around A just because of Colossus, but then that can also be taken care of by the tank. You also do have a Result as a consideration. Dragon Knight, S tier. For sure, DPS and tanking, S tier for Dragon Knights. Sorc, very nice as well for dungeons. Warden DPS is kind of weird. I would say it's somewhere around B or Copium for 4-man content. So that's kind of, yeah. Nightblade, S tier. So yeah, this is a tier list for DPS classes in ESO for 4-man content, I would say. Of course, you're more than feel free to disagree with me, but this is kind of what I've tested and seen and tried out, at least for this patch. Now, for DPSing 12-man content, actually, before we move on to that, let's talk about solo arenas. Probably because a lot of people do solo play or solo arenas, like Maelstrom Arena and Battlefield Hollows. I would probably put the Arcanist somewhere around B or Copium for a couple, well, probably around B still for a lot of, for Battlefield Hollows and Maelstrom Arena. Again, you have to kind of be acquainted with the mechanics, which a lot of people don't tend to be. So again, in the hands of a more experienced player, I'd probably put this at an A. Warden, yeah, that's fun, really. Necromancer, it's kind of weird. I would probably put this at B or Copium. Templar, yeah, S tier. Nightblade, S tier. Sorc, S tier. And DK, S tier. So this is this is the tier list for, I feel like, solo arenas. Okay, so now let's talk about 12-man content for DPS classes. 12-man content is a little bit more of a complicated story because, again, it's all dependent on what your group needs or wants to do in terms of the composition and itemization of the group. However, in terms of straight up damage, we'll talk about that now. I would say DK is absolutely king right now. If I were a raid lead, and this is just speaking from a raid lead perspective, if I were to pick out DPS classes right now, I would pick Dragon Knight first and foremost as the Parse class. I would pick Templar for sure. I'd probably even pick Arcanist as S tier right now. It's not as comparable to DK in a lot of fights. However, it's quite up there with its cleave advantage and it's really, really like easy play style, and giving the ability to be aware of what's going around you more than you would be on your DK or Templar. Warden, I would say, again, you can bring any class to trials. We're talking about now min-maxing. I would say for min-maxing, you're coping on the Warden. You always need at least one Sorc in the group right now, or one Nightblade. So it's kind of up here. In terms of single target, Sorc can be quite competitive, even compared to DK. However, not every Sorc player can pull that off. So we're gonna put Sorc at A, and we're gonna put Nightblade as a DPS, probably garbage, unfortunately. Yeah. Honestly, I feel like Warden should be garbage too. It's kind of coping. I feel like, yeah, I don't know. It's probably around here. So S tier is going to be DK DPS, Templar DPS, Arcanist DPS. A tier is Sorc DPS. Necromancer, on the other hand, because we didn't move the Necromancer from the solo thing, is going to be S or A. Not because it does a lot of damage, but because it provides, again, utility for the group Colossus. And usually it's made to be the buff/debuff bitch of the group. So it's probably going to be A tier or S tier, really kind of fluctuating in and out between, because it is needed as a class that needs to have support DPS sets and so forth. And that's really it for your PvE tier list for ESO when it comes to classes for starting out, for trials, for healing, tanking, DPSing trials and 4-man content, and solo arenas. If you have any thoughts, let me know.